Welcome back. This is the second part of the Chapter 2 online learning module, Neural Mechanisms in Planning and Initiating Movement. We know that nearly every system in the body is designed to support movement, but none more than the nervous and the muscular system. And as we have discovered, there are four main components that are responsible for translating the electrical signals of the brain and the chemical signals of the brain to skeletal movement via muscular activity. The four main components of that learning activity include the brain's planning, initiating, executing, and monitoring abilities. As we carry on from the previous OLM, we're going to move down from the brain into the brainstem now. And the brainstem is located directly below the diencephalon and basically is the junction of the brain and the spinal cord. The brainstem includes the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata, and it acts as a passageway and a switchboard for all messaging that occurs between the spinal cord and the cerebrum.
Hello and
This
welcome
video
to
is a
another
quick snapshot
episode
on the
of
functionality of the
Interactive
brainstem.
Biology TV, where we're making biology fun. My name is Leslie Samuel, and in this episode, episode 27, I'm going to talk about the three parts of the brainstem and what their functions are. So let's get right into it. Now, here we're looking at the human brain, and here we'll see we have the spinal cord, and the spinal cord enters the skull, and where it enters the cranium, the skull, it then becomes brain. And the first part of the brain that we enter is called the brain stem. And the three parts of the brain stem are the medulla, which is this section here, and then we have the pons, and we have the midbrain. So the medulla, pons, and the midbrain, those are the three parts of the brain stem. Now let's look at the functions of those three parts. First, we have the midbrain, and that's involved in processes such as vision, hearing, eye movement, and body movement. Then we have the medulla, and that is involved in maintaining vital body functions such as breathing and heart rate. So you'll notice these are the autonomic processes. In other words, these are the processes that are going to happen whether you think about it or not. These are regulated by the medulla. And last but not least, we have the pons, which is involved in motor control and sensory analysis. So once again, we have the midbrain, the medulla, and the pons. And these three parts make up the brain stem. That's it for this video, and I'll see you in the next one.
In addition to housing the midbrain, pons, and medulla, the brainstem also houses a neural network called the reticular formation. It's at this point where the brain is able to receive and integrate information from all regions of the brain and sensory information from the body. As we previously saw in the video, the brainstem is responsible for most of the autonomic functioning, such as the regulation of breathing and heart rate. It also assists in behaviors such as locomotion, posture, and muscle tone. The spinal cord is the link between the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. It includes the white matter, which is the myelinated axons and dendrites, and gray matter, which includes the cell bodies and the neurons and interneurons from the peripheral nervous system. The outer portion of the spinal cord has axons that send sensory signals up to the brain, and at the same time has motor signals that are traveling down the spinal column. The interior portion of the spinal cord is where the signals are processed through a massive network of synaptic connections. Now, we learned earlier about the term homunculus, the areas of the brain that can be mapped with respect to their functionality. The same can be done for the spinal cord with areas of sensory and motor neurons as depicted in this diagram. In this diagram, we've got a slice of the spinal cord, and we can take a little bit of a closer look at some of the characteristics and functionality of the spinal cord. as I mentioned to you, that sensory information from the peripheral nervous system enters into the spinal cord. It's done so here at the dorsal horn. Motor commands exit out of the ventral horn. And white matter consists of the myelinated axons. Here's the white matter around the outside here. Consists of the myelinated axons from the ascending and descending tracts of neurons. And finally, the gray matter consists of the cell bodies and houses the synaptic connections among the neurons. Now, the details in this diagram are less important than the functionality that I'm about to describe to you. It was once thought that the spinal cord simply made connections between the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. However, it's now recognized that a great deal of information is actually processed right in the spinal cord. The process is called sensory motor integration and is described in this slide. Identifying very specific and isolated functionality of the central nervous system is very hard to do due to the complexity and difficulty of measuring in that area. Models that we do have, though, are based on theories derived from brain research and assessments of people with brain injuries and other circumstantial and convenient sampling. The models give us a general idea of how things work and are based on information from a variety of sources. Modeling of the central nervous system helps predict motor behaviors and the outcomes of interventions. One of the most prominent models or frameworks of motor command structure is by Takatsuki and Okamura of 2008. Their work will be represented in the next 3 slides that we talk about, but essentially the notion is that movements and our posture are the only physical means that we have of interacting with our environment. We express our thoughts and emotions through our movements, and they indicate our will or our intentions. Specifically, locomotion is representative of purposeful, goal-directed behaviors that are initiated by signals arising from either volitional processing in the cerebral cortex or emotional processing in the limbic system. Again, the model that we'll look at in the next few slides will represent that. Regardless of whether the locomotion is volitional or emotional, it is accompanied by automatically controlled movement processes, such as the adjustment of postural muscle tone and rhythmic limb movements that are unconsciously executed. Sensory motor integration at the level of the brainstem and spinal cord plays a major role in this automatic control. Signals processed in the basal ganglia and the cerebellum act on the cerebral cortex, the limbic system, and the brainstem, so that locomotor behaviors are appropriately and precisely regulated depending on the behavioral context. The purpose of this review is to describe how purposeful locomotion behaviors are initiated, executed, and regulated so as to enable locomotor subjects to interact with and adapt to their environment. Part of this model depicts a typical motor skill processing that is planned and initiated from a cognitive frame of reference. You'll notice that initiation of movement activity starts in the cerebral cortex, and the black lines represent part of the cycle of processing that occurs. So eventually the messaging works its way down the spinal cord and into the muscles required. I also mentioned that some of the motor actions are initiated from an emotional reference in the limbic system. And again, here we can see the gray arrows that represent that activity here and working their way through and eventually down again to the muscles that need to be initiated. The final aspect of this model that I want to point out is the contribution of the limbic system. It's represented by the orange lines and is responsible for the monitoring and ongoing regulation. The execution is the function of the peripheral nervous system. Again, you'll see the feedback loop coming up to the brain here. Movement planning and initiation in the brain uses both feed-forward and feedback control. Feed-forward control are those commands that originate in the major brain structures and proceed relatively unabated to their target, in other words, the muscles. In particular, they are minimally influenced by sensory feedback arising from muscles and other body structures. This type of control system is otherwise known as open-loop control and may provide what are called centrally pre-programmed movements. Those movements are a set of instructions compiled by our central nervous system in advance of a rapid movement and then sent to our muscles so that they execute the movement without the need of feedback during the action. Feedback control systems, also known as closed-loop control, are largely influenced by sensory feedback that regulates and changes the nature of the feed-forward commands. In some cases, such as reflexes, feedback may initiate and regulate the entire movement process. In goal-directed movements, feedback is always influencing movement control processes in both the brain and the spinal cord. The differences then between feed-forward and feedback control lie in the origins of the control signals and the amount of control. Continuous control is a way of controlling slow continuous movements through the use of feedback generated by movements to make corrections before the movement ends. It's often also referred to as closed-loop control because the feedback information loops back to the performer during the movement. There are a variety of sources of feedback for both of the systems, and those are listed in this slide. In a strict feed-forward system, as depicted in this diagram by the solid lines from motor planning down to movement, the sensory feedback is not really used at all to influence the eventual motor command, and it's only used to help plan for subsequent movements. Using the same model, the dashed lines in this figure represent a strict feedback system, when sensory feedback directly modifies the motor commands and sometimes may initiate the motor commands. In some cases, like reflexes, the feedback control process may also initiate and regulate the entire movement process. This model represents the breadth of sensory information that's being passed around with respect to the motor command. Basically, as I've said and stated before, we use information from several sources, as we see in this diagram, to help us control our movements. Vision is often thought to be the most dominant sense, but we could not move effectively without using balance, hearing, touch, and the information our body detects about the position and movements of our limbs in space, which is referred to as proprioception or kinesthesis. The term sensory integration also refers to the fact that we typically use information from a variety of senses anytime we control our movement. There are two ways in which we control our movements. Continuous control allows us to use feedback to make corrections during slow, continuous tasks. And when we need to complete a rapid, discrete action, we use no feedback control to pre-plan our movement. Plasticity in the brain is the key to motor learning. It enables the brain to be able to change as a result of practice and training. The central nervous system adapts in a variety of ways to these two items. Practice is aimed primarily at improving motor skills, whereas when we train, we're emphasizing physiological adaptations. In these definitions, you'll see that training is a little bit broader in context in that it encompasses knowledge, skills, and the abilities as a result of coaching expertise, whereas practice is the emphasis and rehearsal of the same activity over and over in order to create mastery of that activity. Hence the term practice makes perfect, when in fact we all know by now that it's perfect practice that makes perfect. Now, as an athlete gets more proficient, it's not actually more brain that is used to control an activity. In fact, it's the opposite. The brain becomes much more efficient, and that automaticity begins to develop. And so a smaller area of the brain is one of the central nervous system's adaptations to practice. Conversely, when we're in a more complex learning situation and the action is more than repetitive and is a little bit more integrated, the brain actually uses more areas, and it's thought that this reflects the use of previously unused resources, in other words, unused portions of the brain, to maximize movement capability. Of course, this is part of the journey, and eventually the brain will narrow its use of the portion of the brain necessary, and the efficiency that I spoke in the earlier slide will result. Learning a new activity can alter the brain in different ways in different parts of the brain. As we see in this MRI, it shows regions of the brain that have decreased in activity, which are represented by the blue coloring, and areas of the brain that have increased in activity, which are represented in orange, following hundreds of practice trials of a fine motor skill. Again, different parts of the brains are responsible for different purposes, and that's the representation of the different coloration in the MRIs. Changes in areas of activation reflect changes in neuronal structure in both the brain and the spinal cord. More synaptic connections and more efficient neurotransmitter receptor sites are formed, and the most efficient neural pathways are found and used to a greater extent than another pathway. These changes reveal that the brain is quite plastic. It can change its morphological structure, in other words, create new synapses, and even the somatopic map of motor and sensory areas, such as the Brodmann areas and perhaps even the homunculus, can be altered. Current research indicates that the brain is much more adaptable or plastic than once believed. Dramatic examples of this plasticity can be found following amputation in humans and animals, particularly within the somatosensory cortex. For example, the sensory cortical region corresponding to the missing limb of an amputee may get taken over by a neighboring sensory region. This takeover and topographical reorganization may result in strange sensations, such as feeling a phantom limb. Prominent brain plasticity researcher Michael Merzenich maintains that plasticity remains even into old age, and that older individuals can use positive brain changes to overcome losses in sensation, cognition, memory, and motor control. This is a model of neurological protective mechanisms that arise from exercise based on the work of Cotman and Davenport. In this model, exercise produces a number of hormonal growth factors to stimulate neuronal and other tissue growth. In addition, genes are stimulated to create proteins for tissue growth and repair. Thus, exercise over the long term leads to a better neural health and functionality. At the same time, the negative consequences of various diseases and dysfunction, including inflammation, are blunted by exercise. Many of the brain-related changes that result from central nervous system adaptations to training are listed in this slide. As I stated previously, the causal biological research data is lacking specifically around exercise in the elderly. However, it is associated and has been reported, as I mentioned, with indications of improved health, reduced anxiety, and improved self-efficacy. The best explanation for the effects of exercise on mental health is very complex and is best represented in a biopsychosocial model. A biopsychosocial model can also represent the impact of exercise or social interaction that benefits children. However, the interaction between genetics and social and psychological health and development makes causal relationships extremely difficult to tease out. Social, cultural, and socio-economic influences are always present. However, exercise is suggested to improve children's cognitive health, but again, causal biological research data are lacking in this area as well. The reason that it's so difficult, of course, we talked about in growth and development, to narrow down any specific intervention as the cause for an improvement, is that children are constantly in a state of development. And in the case of children playing, is it the exercise, the social interaction, or something else that benefits these kids? Let's take a quick peek at the topic of central nervous system fatigue. And although the behavioral expressions of fatigue don't always correlate with the physiological indices, we do know that fatigue is defined as the inability to produce the required or expected force or effort that is anticipated. It's well known that in a tiring muscle, physiological and biochemical mechanisms are associated with fatigue, such as depletion of ATP and energy substrates, and the accumulation of lactate and other metabolic byproducts that impair cellular function. But there's a growing recognition that the central nervous system also fatigues. Recent evidence points to the fact that long-term fatiguing exercises like a marathon or a triathlon actually reduce reflex sensitivity, such as weakening the stretch reflex response and making it difficult to elicit. This could be due to the removal of the facilitation from muscle spindles afferents or presynaptic inhibition of the reflex circuitry. Alternatively, it could be that the sensory endings in the muscle, mostly the chemoreceptors and nociceptors, respond to a buildup of metabolic waste and may have powerful effects on the inhibitory interneurons connecting to motor neurons in the spinal cord. A number of authors have recently put forth evidence that suggests glycogen depletion and faltering neurotransmitter regulation during fatiguing exercise are culprits in the central nervous system fatigue. It is thought that fatiguing conditions lead to a loss in central drive, perhaps from lowered oxygen levels. It's also been hypothesized that non-motor areas in the brain begin integrating signals differently, which may alter sensations and behavioral states. And some evidence points to disruptions in the neurochemical systems, including serotonin, acetylcholine, and dopamine. Finally, researchers have noted that central fatigue is not only associated with exercise, but may be a contributor to conditions like chronic fatigue syndrome. This concludes the second chapter, both part 1 and part 2, and this OLM. So again, I encourage you to go back and review any things that maybe were of concern to you, and don't forget to connect the lecture notes to the textbook readings.